Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the history of a diagnosis that took nearly 150 years to even define: borderline personality disorder. We're going to trace the long, complex, and often winding road of how this really misunderstood condition finally got a name. I want to start with these words from the poet Theodore Rothke. They just perfectly capture this sense of profound inner turmoil and exposure. You know, that feeling of having no secrets because your pain is just so visible? It's a really powerful way to frame the subject of our explainer today. So that brings us right to the core question. What does it actually mean to be on the borderline? To really get it, we first have to understand the puzzle that clinicians were facing for more than a century, trying to make sense of a condition that just didn't seem to fit neatly into any of their existing boxes. All right, so let's start at the beginning. We're going to explore this early history where the whole concept was basically an uncharted territory on the map of the human mind. I mean, just look at this timeline. It stretches from 1835 all the way to 1980. You can see right away that the journey from just a vague idea to an official diagnosis was a really slow, painstaking process. We're talking nearly 150 years of clinical observation and debate. It really kicks off around 1835 with J.C. Pritchard's idea of moral insanity. And you have to understand, for the time, this was a pretty groundbreaking concept. He was trying to give a name to conditions that weren't about delusions or problems with intellect, but about this deep-seated emotional and behavioral disturbance, what he called a morbid perversion of the natural feelings. Then, fast forward to 1905, and Emil Kraepelin introduces the term morbid personalities. He saw these as borderline states, somewhere between insanity and normality. The thing is, his category was incredibly broad. It included what we might now call borderline, antisocial, and paranoid traits all lumped together. And that breadth, well, it became a problem, because the concept often got boiled down to just antisocial behavior. And as you can imagine, this led to decades of serious confusion. For a long, long time, these borderline states were misunderstood as just milder forms of schizophrenia. You had terms floating around like ambulatory schizophrenia or pseudo-neurotic schizophrenia that, while they pointed to the severe inner turmoil, were ultimately clouding the picture by linking it to the wrong family of disorders. Okay, so this brings us to a real turning point in the 1960s and 70s. This is when researchers finally started applying rigorous, actual scientific methods to try and solve this diagnostic puzzle once and for all. Now, this 1968 study by Roy Grinker and his colleagues was a huge moment. For really the first time, they moved beyond just subjective descriptions. They identified 4 fundamental data-backed characteristics of what they called the borderline syndrome: chronic anger, problems in relationships, a disturbed sense of identity, and a really deep depression rooted in loneliness. This gave them the first real objective framework. But even with this new data, the debate was far from over. The big question in the 1970s was basically this: is this thing a form of schizophrenia, like some genetic studies were hinting at? Or is it an affective, a mood disorder, where all the intense relationship drama was really just an attempt to feel stable? So the real question became, is this its own unique disorder, or is it just a weird version of something else? And this is where we see the big breakthrough. In 1975, John Gunderson and Margaret Singer published a paper that synthesized all the previous work, and they proposed 6 key criteria. Their argument was really compelling, that borderline personality disorder was its own distinct thing, defined by this unique cocktail of intense emotions, impulsivity, a fragile identity hidden behind a social mask, and deeply disturbed up and down relationship. So all of this incredible work finally came together in 1980. This was the year borderline personality disorder was officially included in the DSM-3, the big manual of mental disorders. And this recognition, based on all those decades of research, was huge. It finally solidified the diagnosis and opened the door for more focused study and, maybe most importantly, for treatments that were actually designed for this specific disorder. Okay, so we've seen how the disorder was defined from the outside, right, by its observable symptoms. Now let's switch gears and explore how psychoanalytic thinkers tried to understand the why behind them, to get a glimpse into the inner world of the condition. One of the biggest concepts here is splitting, which was first described by Melanie Klein. It's basically a defense mechanism where you just can't hold both the good and the bad qualities of a person, or even yourself, in your mind at the same time. So what happens is people and situations get sorted into one of two boxes, all good or all bad. And this helps explain those dramatic, painful shifts from idealizing someone one minute to devaluing them the next. All right, next up, we've got identity diffusion, a term that comes from Erik Erikson. And we're not just talking about low self-esteem here. This is a profound lack of a coherent, stable sense of who you are. It can lead to chronic feelings of emptiness and uncertainty about your own identity. In fact, Erikson himself called this the key anchoring symptom, like the fundamental instability that everything else is tied to. And then there's Margaret Mahler's work on child development, which offers another really fascinating piece of the puzzle. She focused on a phase called rapprochement. This is a critical time when a toddler is kind of torn, right? They want to run off and be independent, but they're also terrified of losing their mom's security. Mahler's theory was that if a mother isn't emotionally available during this critical back and forth, the child might fail to internalize that sense of safety, leading to a fragile sense of self and a lifelong fear of abandonment. All right, so let's put it all together now, the descriptive research, the psychoanalytic insights, and look at the composite clinical picture that finally emerged from this long, long history. What's great about this is that it really brings everything we've talked about together into these 9 core features. You can see all the themes right here: that unstable sense of self or identity disturbance, the intense up and down relationships, the impulsivity, the chronic anger, and that deep, deep fear of being alone. It's an amazing synthesis of almost a century of observation, painting this coherent portrait that all revolves around one core theme: instability. Instability in self-image, in mood, and in relationships. So think about it. We've just walked through a 150-year journey just to get a handle on one single disorder. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What will the next 150 years reveal about the human mind? Ultimately, our understanding is always evolving, and the story of this diagnosis, it shows us just how far we've come, but it also reminds us how much further we still have to go in understanding the incredible complexities of the human mind.